Okay, yeah,
Definitely.
I figured you don't mind. Dr. Bach's like, you forgot to do that. I'm like, yeah, I know, I got it. Anyway, so, all right. Well, everyone, thanks for coming tonight. It's good to have everyone back, 7:30 sharp here. So I'm Eric Chabot. You guys used to this, but we are excited to be back here again tonight. And I'm really excited about tonight because we have a real special guest. It's the first time actually I'm meeting Dr. Bass face to face, but I actually know who he is. We have a lot of mutual friends, and I know some of the work he's done. But I got really excited about his book, which I'm about to show on a slide in a minute, that he wrote on the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And so I'm excited to go on this topic because, you know, we have specialized in this. And if you're, some of you aren't at Ohio State with us, some of you are, but at our campus ministry, we did a debate with the resurrection. We had Mike Lacona come, and he debated a atheist named Larry Shapiro. They debated that. Then I also had Mike lecture a couple times. He did a couple lectures on the resurrection. I've known Mike for a long time. So I've tried to make the resurrection as one of our focal points of our apologetics ministry at Ohio State. I don't take it lightly. Of course, we've had other topics, but I feel that is in the top three we try to hit on every couple years or so. So maybe if COVID goes away, maybe we can get Dr. Bass to come into the campus someday. I know he wants to come to Columbus, Ohio so badly, and I know he wants to come to the Buckeye Lands. So I know he just,
Yeah, I'd love to.
he's so excited. But
Ready.
anyway, yeah. So anyway, so I'm going to pull up some slides here as usual, and we'll go ahead and talk about the book that Dr. Bass has written here. Well, first of all, before I say it, Dr. Bass, tell us about yourself. You're located in Dallas right now, and you're a DTS grad. You got your Ph.D. at DTS. I know that. And so before I jump on the slides here, go ahead and tell us about yourself real quick.
Yeah, I just share post PhD. It's been a fun journey. I planted a church, did that for 6 years, and while I was doing that, I was part-time professor at DTS. I taught Greek there for 5 summers, and also taught at another Bible college. I debated some prominent atheists like Bart Ehrman and Richard Carrier and Dan Barker, and a Muslim imam at a mosque here actually in Dallas. And about 3 years ago, my wife and I both felt the Lord lead us to move and sell everything off and go to Amman, Jordan, go to the Middle East. So everybody was leaving the Middle East and we were going to the Middle East. But there's a seminary there called Jordan Evangelical Theological Seminary, probably the largest evangelical seminary in the Middle East. And it's been just an awesome privilege to teach there. I'm their professor of New Testament. I technically still am right now. I'm actually teaching via Zoom, the students back there, and they're still shut down. So even the professors that are living there are still doing teaching through Zoom. And so we've been doing that. My wife and I both also served with an NGO helping with refugees. So we got to see refugees from Syria and Iraq and even Yemen. And some of them came to Christ, got to baptize some of them in the Jordan River, right where Jesus was baptized. So that was pretty awesome. So yeah, and then I was saying at the beginning, we came here not to move back, but just to promote my book for a month and then go back. And then the whole COVID thing shut us down. So even right now, if we tried to fly back to Amman, they wouldn't let us in, or they'd force us to quarantine in very horrible, torturous ways. So we would not do that. So we're here as of right now and waiting for what the Lord has next for us.
So when you came back to Dallas, did you have a house there or anything? You just kind of living, what are you doing living-wise? You sold everything, you said. So what are you doing?
Yeah, we had a house for 9 years in Frisco,
Okay.
right outside of Plano and Dallas. And we sold everything. So all we had was just the stuff that we packed to come here for a month. And we just recently got everything shipped back. So we actually had 2 cats there. So we got the 2 cats there. They suffered. But they got here. And then we had all our luggage actually just get here about a couple weeks ago. And so now we're pretty much transitioned here. I'm looking for maybe a full-time professor position somewhere. I've got some options here, but so we'll see.
Interesting. At least you got your books here. So I see right behind you. You can't leave without your books. So anyway, okay. All right. Let me pull up some slides here. Just give me a second. All right. Okay. So let's go to your book here. Pull up your, there we go. Okay. So everyone, this is the book that Dr. Bass has written. It's called the Bedrock of Christianity, Unalterable Facts of Jesus' Death and Resurrection. And it was the foreword was written by Darrell Bach, who we've had on Zoom call a couple times. Of course, I'm sure Dr. Bass studied with Dr. Bach at Dallas. No way around that, right? But anyway, so this book is really a gem. I finished it, I think like 6 weeks ago, but it's not incredibly long, but it's good. It's got a lot of history in it, a lot of good information, a lot of contextual information, just a really good overall book. And let me say that, just to throw it out there, when I self-published my own book on the resurrection, since it sold 10 million copies, I just want to say that that's a joke. I just want to say that Dr. Bass's book just filled in all kinds of gaps there. As I was reading, I was thinking, oh, that's a little tidbit I didn't think about. Another tidbit there, another tidbit there. So there's just all kinds of stuff in this book. So I encourage you to get it. You can get it on Kindle or Amazon, but it's a great book to hand to people. It's great. It's not like, as I'll show a slide in a moment, not like someone else's book we know is 780 pages on the resurrection. But anyway, so that's the book, and that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. And so I noticed it was called, when I got this book, when I saw it came out, and I got it from the publisher, it said The Bedrock of Christianity. And so I was thinking, well, where have I heard that? Like the bedrock. And so I'm just going to go to a slide really quick, and I'll back up in a minute to the other one. But I first read about the bedrock terminology when I was reading Michael Lacona's book, his massive dissertation he did on the resurrection, ways back. And this was, I don't want to, promote Mike's book, but this book is about 700-800 pages. And I remember, it's a great book. I mean, obviously I love it, but I remember selling it at the table when people came up to buy it when he was here. They're like $50. I'm like, darn right. So that's what you got to pay for. Anyway, but these bedrock points came out in his book. And I remember reading the first time I heard the bedrock phrase, that these 3 facts are about the historical Jesus are accepted by critical scholars and historians. And that, of course, is Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. And then number 2, that the disciples believed that they saw Jesus rise they saw him after the resurrection. They believed they had experiences that transformed their lives. So they generally believed they saw the risen Christ. And then, of course, number 3, a few years after Jesus' death, Paul comes to faith. And of course, he believes that Jesus appeared to him on the Damascus Road. And so these things stuck out in my mind as I started reading Dr. Bass's book. And so then if we go back to Dr. Bass's book here, let me give you a second here if I get back to the slide. Here it is. That it's interesting, he says the goal of this book right here, he says that the goal of this book, The Bedrock of Christianity, is similar but even bolder. Instead of just a few scholars from different backgrounds, imagine all scholars alive today are teaching the relevant fields of ancient history, classics, and biblical studies from universities and seminaries across the world, locked up in the Harvard Divinity School library, and they can form a consensus on the facts concerning Jesus and early Christianity. Could they find agreement? Yes, and this book will show you where they all agree. So let's jump into what you mean by the bedrock, as I've kind of given a little, little headway there. We started, but why is this topic so important, and what are you doing with it like the bedrock? What do we mean by that when you define that?
Yeah, before I answer that, just one point. Lacona his work is excellent. He actually endorsed my book as well, and I love his book. But I actually got the bedrock from N.T. Wright's book, The Resurrection of the Son of God.
Oh, I should have known that.
when he discusses, it's a small little tidbit, though. It may not have hit you the same way. It is 740-something pages. Right. But when he actually discusses the passage in 1 Corinthians 15, he calls it at one point unalterable Christian bedrock, and that phrase, those 3 words, just hit me like lightning. I just thought that was so powerful, and I love that. And then I was already wanting to write a book on the resurrection, so I thought, okay, if I write a book on the resurrection, I'm going to call it the unalterable bedrock of Christianity. That was my goal. And then the publisher and I, Lexham, that I published it with, we had we butted heads a little bit about unalterable. They didn't like that; it didn't really flow off the tongue, so we ended up with the bedrock of Christianity. So that's where the title came from. But basically, I mean the same thing that Lacona means, and the same thing that N.T. Wright means, which is basically the historical sources and facts that are agreed upon at all times, everywhere, by all. So I think the only thing that reaches that high bar of bedrock is if all the scholars across the board that actually have credentials in these areas agree on it. And that's what I put on under a bedrock, or unalterable bedrock.
Okay. Now, when we since I've used the sometimes we talk about the bedrock, and it's sometimes come out, we call the minimal facts argument that Mike Lacona uses and Gary Habermas, these minimal facts like we're talking about. The one thing that I have noticed over the years when I see Christians use this argument, and the great thing about your book, of course, you deal with this and you know the issues, but is that so let's say we're talking to somebody about the bedrock, and we say, you're talking to an agnostic or someone, not a Jesus myth, or like Richard Carrier doesn't believe Jesus existed. So that's a whole other topic. But someone
that's why I say 99%. I'm basically
yeah, 99%. So
I'm being charitable to the
right.
myth. I probably shouldn't be, but
right. We'll stick with Bart Ehrman's view. At least he knows Jesus existed. But so you're talking to someone and you start talking about Jesus, and we say, do you believe he really died? Yeah. I mean, do you believe he, was buried, or do you believe he, the disciples believe they had appearances? Yes. Do you believe something happened to Paul? So let's say we get people to agree on these bedrock facts that all the critical scholars agree on, and then we're talking to them. We say, yeah, all these scholars agree on this. These critical scholars, agnostic scholars, not even evangelical Christian scholars, Jewish scholars, all agree that, Jesus' death by crucifixion is a fact, or at least there's strong enough evidence to say it's a fact. And the disciples believe they saw the risen Jesus, and something happened to Paul. Don't you think that one thing that I would be asking if I was on the other side of the argument, I would be saying, well, why? Why do they hold to these facts? What is it that's so strong about these issues that makes it kind of like a bedrock fact? So how would you answer that? Would you agree? Instead of just saying, well, this is what they say, you have to explain why.
No, it's an excellent point, and I do make that point in the book that we don't believe these facts just because all the scholars agree on this. So we don't just believe it because of that, but it's just a fascinating thing when these scholars disagree on just about everything. When it comes to early Christianity, there's so many things they disagree on. When you get down to the common ground of what they do agree on, it's really fascinating when they all come together and say, okay, we all affirm this. And so that's why it's so strong. But really the reason why they do it is because of the robust evidence. So it's the same reason why we believe that the temple was destroyed in AD 70 by the Romans. We have robust evidence. You can actually go to Jerusalem. You can touch the stones. We have a first century eyewitness, Josephus, telling us. We have clear evidence that this happened. And it's the same thing with the issues concerning the historical Jesus, his death, and I would say his resurrection and the appearances, and then the movement that arose in Jerusalem that went on to conquer the world. But just some examples that I'm sure people who tune in know about. But the strongest, earliest evidence that I use pretty much specifically in this book is Paul's early letters and the creeds and these hymns that Paul is quoting that's in his letters that go back even earlier, that go back to within 5 to 10 years after Jesus' death. But we also have the Gospels, we have Acts, we have Josephus, we have Tacitus, we have Pliny the Younger, we have Lucian of Samosata, we have early Christian, Jewish, Roman, Greek writers, historians, all from right at about 150 years at most after Jesus, first century, early second century, and they testify to at least some or all of the bedrock facts that I lay out in the book. That's why, though, we believe it because of the robust evidence. It's basically why we believe any historical fact that Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, that go down the list of that Socrates was condemned by the Senate and by leading the youth astray and drank the hemlock. I mean, how do we know that? We know it because of the solid sources that we have, and so that's why they agree across the board.
Yeah, and it's kind of like if someone comes to me and says, well, evolution's a fact. Of course, you have to define evolution. There's so many different definitions. But when they tell me all scientists agree on these points, I'm always going to say back to them, well, tell me why is there a consensus? Can you tell me why? So I think we just need to, when we're explaining these, if you're using these in a tactical perspective, you've got to at least be able to know how to go to the evidence, the robust evidence, and show why these are facts versus just saying scholar A says this and scholar B says that, as you say in your book. So I just want to point that out to everybody if they start to get into this information. So you mentioned Paul. You spent a lot of time in your book on Paul, which is great. And I know that, you just mentioned that you start with Paul, mostly the evidence from Paul's letters. And we know that, Paul's letters are the earliest records we have for Jesus' death and resurrection. But why do you think a lot of people, just generally speaking, I share this with people, I've used Paul just like you, and they just seem to always want to go right to the Gospels. They just kind of skip, Paul's just not, they don't think of Paul like the earliest and the best, or maybe like the earliest sources. Why do you think there's a tendency just to go right to the Gospels? Is it because the Gospels are biographies and Paul's letters aren't, or what do you think?
Right. Yeah, and really, there's nothing wrong at all with going to the Gospels. I think when you go to the Gospels, the thing is you're just going into a huge world of, the last 250 years of debate on the historical Jesus, on the authorship of the Gospels, on the sources. And
Right.
so I think that is a debate that needs to be had. And I would love to, God willing, write books dealing with that debate and argue strongly that the Gospels are written by eyewitnesses and that we can trust the words of Jesus. In fact, when I debated Bart Ehrman, that was my case that I made, that Jesus claimed to be God. I made the case based on the sayings in the Gospels that even Bart Ehrman agreed Jesus said. And so if Jesus said this, then I think you have to agree that he claimed to be God. But I go to Paul, just like you do probably, because it's basically the common ground. I'm basically doing what I think we have a long line of examples going back to Jesus. When Jesus debated with the Sadducees, he quoted not from Daniel to prove the resurrection, but he quoted from Exodus, because the Sadducees only accepted the Torah. Paul, when he's arguing with the philosophers in Athens, he doesn't quote the Bible, he quotes their own poets. And going into the early church fathers, Justin Martyr, when he debates the Jew Trypho, he says, I'm only going to quote things that you agree are scripture. So I think that common ground aspect, I think we have a long tradition of doing that. And so I'm basically, for the more skeptical Bart Ehrman type world, I'm going, okay, here's where we all agree. Now, where does these truths, these facts, where do they lead us? If we follow this evidence where it leads, where does it lead us? And I think it definitely leads us to the risen Christ. So
right.
That's why I start with Paul, basically common ground.
And so you talked about the creed a little bit in 1 Corinthians 15, that passage that we like to point to, which is really the earliest. I think it's the earliest. I was looking at Thessalonians too, but I think this is really, let's just say it's definitely one of the earliest records we have for Jesus's death, burial, and resurrection. And of course, there's been a lot of work on this, but I'm not sure we understand how important this is, because this really puts the gospel, the death, burial, resurrection, the proclamation of it, puts it way back. And I have a little timeline, a little chart here, my little, whatever you want to call it, my New Testament timeline. There's a lot more needs to be filled in. But, if you go back to both 30 and 40, Jesus is crucified, and then Paul's letter is written in that period between, 48 and 60, somewhere in that range. And then you go back to the creed. I mean, that is pushing the 1 Corinthians 15 text way back. He's got to receive it somewhere between 30 and 40. When you estimate that, where Paul's getting that information?
Yeah, I say in the book, 10 years that's the max that I found anyone willing to put it, to be about 10 years after Jesus's death. So maybe 40 would be like the cutoff. I mean, this would be the max. And the earliest would be the late, great, scholar James Dunn. He just died, I think, earlier this year. Dunn puts it in his big book, Jesus Remembered. He argues that the composition of this creed by the earliest apostles, this would be people like James and Peter, people from, the earliest followers of Jesus in Jerusalem, they probably composed this creedal formula that was probably memorizable within months of Jesus's death, which makes sense. I mean, it makes sense that after Jesus's death, resurrection, we have the 40 days of him appearing to people. He ascends into heaven. 10 days later, he pours out the Holy Spirit. We have Pentecost, and then what happens? Immediately, we see the believers going off into other places. Like in Acts 8, we see people, the Samaritans receiving the Holy Spirit and the apostles going there. What did they teach them? They taught them something. This is probably what they taught them as kind of a foundation for their faith. They taught them probably expounding each of these lines. Christ died. What did that look like? It probably looked like something like we read in the Gospels, telling the story of his suffering and his arrest and his trials and his crucifixion and all the rest. But in a short creedal formula, that's why we have it the way we have it there. It was very memorizable, and it gave people, new believers, the foundation of their faith. And so yeah, I think Dunn is right. I think it goes back to within months of Jesus's death, which is an incredible thing. I mean, this is really unparalleled in any other religion or just about any philosophy, anything in the ancient world. To have something that early that's foundational to the statement of faith is really incredible. And again, this is something that everyone agrees on. I mean, this isn't something that's debated. Even the mythicists will agree with this one, except for good old Robert Price. Robert Price actually argues that the whole thing's an interpolation. He's the only scholar to ever argue that. He argues the whole thing was like added later to Paul's letter of Corinthians, which we have no textual evidence for that at all. But even Richard Carrier would say that it within a decade.
I did see that.
So,
yeah,
so it's an incredible thing that we know that was what the earliest Christians in Jerusalem were proclaiming in the first decade of Christianity. An incredible thing.
Right. And, I think what everyone needs to understand what Dr. Bass is saying is that when Paul talks about this creed, he says he received this, I passed on to you. Paul's saying he received this information from somewhere else. Okay. Obviously, if we're getting to Galatians, it says he received the gospel directly from Jesus, but then the same word is used in 1 Corinthians 15. But you read the rest of the passage, he mentions all these appearances, and he mentions Peter here. And so the question, it seems like he's saying, he is saying, he's saying, I received this information from someone else, by an oral transmission of some kind. There's some debate, there's arguments, where he may have received it. My argument is I think he got it. Well, I think Dr. Bass, you agree, in Jerusalem, when he's visiting Peter in Galatia. I mean, there's, some people say Antioch or something, but I think that's the best bet. Do you agree with that? He maybe received it with Peter. And we can't say 100%, but I think there's a pretty good bet for that.
Yeah, it's amazing. The debate on it actually, what I disagree with actually puts it even earlier when Paul received it, because some scholars, like you said, they put it in Antioch, but they also will put it even right in Damascus right after Paul's conversion. So when he was converted in Damascus, that's when the Christians taught him this in Damascus. So this would put it right after Paul's conversion, and Paul's conversion is universally dated within a year and a half of Jesus's conversion. So, but I do think that we should probably put it about 3 years later, as Paul lays out his chronology in Galatians. I think we should put it in 37 AD. This is when Paul met with Peter and James, the brother of Jesus. It makes sense that was where he learned, and he appeared to Peter, and he appeared to James, and he appeared to the 12. It makes more sense that that's where he got that information, not in Damascus. And so I would put it, that's where I would put it.
Now, from my experience using this passage with people, when they're kind of maybe a biblically literate about the New Testament evidence for Jesus, that when I show them this as 1 Corinthians 15, because they'll hear something on the internet, well, the Gospels are dated too late. We can't trust the Gospels, blah, 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 blah. And then when I point to Paul and I go to this, they're just like, I never even heard this. I never heard that. I never knew anything about this. And so I always tell people, honestly, and from a tactical perspective, why go to the Gospels right away? You can use this. It's just a great passage, and it's early, and I use it all the time, but a lot of people just don't know about it. So I think it's a gem to use if you can remember. But anyway, one last thing about that text, the 1 Corinthians 15. So I noticed in your book, when you talk about, it's talking about the Messiah dying for our sins according to the scriptures. We know in this passage that Paul he's not so nice to say, hey, I got this understanding of Jesus dying from the scriptures from this passage in the Jewish scriptures, or this passage. He doesn't list them, right? So I noticed in your book, you made a pretty, reasonable inference that he's probably pointing to Isaiah 53, because he's talking about the substitutionary atonement aspect. And then you talked about some of the Dead Sea Scrolls and other things. So in your opinion, you think that Paul's most likely is reading the Septuagint version of Isaiah 53 somewhere in there. That's where he's getting that from, the Messiah dying for our sins.
Yeah, I think that's in Paul's mind, and and also you could go back to the original composers of the creed. I think that's what's in their mind. Peter, James, the original disciples of Jesus, when they put that together and said Christ died for our sins, where would they have gotten that? In the scriptures. When they say scriptures, they mean what we call the Old Testament books. The only place you're going to find a direct statement of anyone dying for someone's sins is the Isaiah 53 passage. That's the one place where you get a clear substitutionary type statement of, by his wounds we are healed. He was crushed for our iniquities. He bore our sins. And I bring out the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's interesting, the Isaiah passage in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is of course a lot earlier than our Hebrew manuscripts that all our Old Testament translations are based on. It makes it even stronger. It makes it even specifically more about the substitutionary death for sins. So that may have been also what Paul was reading, what the original disciples were reading. They probably had the Septuagint as well, but I think Paul for sure knew Hebrew. So
right.
He knew Hebrew. He would have known what we see probably in the Dead Sea Scroll version.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, that's great. So remember the 1 Corinthians 15 creed, very powerful piece of evidence, and that's one of the earliest records we have for Jesus's death, burial, and resurrection.
And
Okay.
I'll just add, as you made the point that about the Gospels, I
Yeah.
think what we have, I did that chart in my book where I try to show that if you follow the creed, you're basically following what we call the passion narratives of the gospel. So you
Right.
basically have the whole story of Jesus's leading up to his death. You then have the burial. You then have the resurrection, and then you have the appearances. And that's exactly what all four gospels, that's how they end. And so it's interesting that they follow that same pattern that we see in the earliest creed. So really, what are the gospels? I argue when I teach on the gospels that the gospels are basically the apostolic preaching that's summarized in this creed, expanded out in a narrative form, made into like a new creation, basically. I mean, I think the gospels are something brand new. There's nothing like them. I mean, there's things like them, but nothing completely like them, equal to them in the ancient world. They're a new literary creation, like Plato's dialogues, for example. No one ever taught philosophy the way Plato did with the dialogues, and really no one's ever been able to match him since.
Right.
And the same thing with the Gospels. The Gospels are a unique literary creation that no one's matched since, and you can't find anything like before. So
That would get into the genre issue, which we could have Mike and you talk about that for a long time, but we won't get into that. Anyway, that's that's an interesting, fascinating topic though. Okay, so let's talk about the appearances. So one of the bedrock facts that you mentioned are a lot of scholars, critical scholars, even Bart Ehrman, I have it on a slide in a second, agrees that the disciples definitely had experiences where they believed that Jesus appeared to them. It's not really where scholars are like saying, no, they lied about it or they just made this up. It seems to be pretty well established that they all believe that disciples had genuine experiences they believe are the risen Jesus. You have these various, appearances of groups, individuals on various locations, things like that. I can't go into each one of them, but they're out there. And then, so what you're saying is in your book, as far as one of the bedrocks is if you take people like Bart, actually, I think he calls himself an atheist now. Sorry to be technically correct. He's moved from agnosticism to atheism, whatever that is. But anyway, the point is that he definitely believes that the disciples, believe for sure that Jesus appeared to them. They're not lying about it, and that they're sincere. They believe it. Same thing with a guy like E.P. Sanders, not the most. I don't think he's one of, considered like an Orthodox Christian or whatever, but I mean, he's done a lot of scholarship, as we know, but, he says Jesus's disciples definitely had experiences. It's a fact, no doubt about it. And then someone like Paula Fredrickson, by the way, she's Jewish, right? Isn't she Paula Fredrickson? Yeah. She says, look what she says there. I know in their own terms what they saw was the raised Jesus. I'm not saying that they really did see the raised Jesus. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw by doing a story, and they must have seen something. So there's not a lot of debate that the disciples think they saw the risen Christ, okay? And so mostly
absolutely convinced that it was Jesus, the man who was crucified, rose again and appeared to them.
Yeah, and so the problem we get into, as you know, since you've done debates with Bart and Richard Carey and others, is that we're just not agreeing what explains it, what explains the appearances. Of course, I believe it's the bodily resurrection of Jesus, and you do, but it seems like we're always debating these other categories. What could account for what did the disciples see? Obviously, straightforward reading of the Gospels and everything. Of course, I believe Jesus physically appeared to them. That accounts for it. But a couple of things that are out on the table a lot of times. One thing that's gotten kind of popular is the vision hypothesis. We know that Ehrman says this in his book right here. He says, visions can account for the resurrection appearances. He doesn't care what kind they are, whether objective or so, whether they're, mental thing in their minds or whether there's something out there they see, but it's still a vision. The point is that he uses that vision hypothesis. And so other scholars have said that throughout the years. And so tell us what's kind of challenging about, let's say you're debating Bart, maybe he brought this up in your debate. I don't know if you debated the vision thing, but you're debating whether Jesus was God, I know, but what's wrong with that? And like, why is that kind of vague? Like, why, just to punt to like the vision hypothesis, how do we get around that? What's that do?
Yeah, one point on Bart Ehrman though that's very interesting, kind of a evolution of his view on that. You quoted just now, that was his earlier book, I think from the 90s, and in that book he does basically adhere to the hallucination hypothesis, basically that they were hallucinating in some way. And that's what he said in some of his earlier debates around that time, and maybe all the way up to, I don't know, about 2016. But this one, yeah, this quote you have right here, the other one, if you go back
The
to the
Visions one.
Yeah, the not that one, the other one.
Oh, this one back here. Yeah, let me go up.
Yeah, the one at the top. That one's from how Jesus became God, which is his most recent book on early Christianity. And
that's
in
that one.
No,
that's the one. That's the one. And Jesus became God, right there on the Visions.
Oh, so you're not directly quoting him?
Yeah, no, I am quoting. Well, I'm paraphrasing a little bit.
Okay,
yeah, but that's what he says.
Okay, yeah, because if you go to that full quote though, because he says they're either veridical or non-veridical, but he then says, I'm not gonna. He basically says he goes to agnosticism. So he basically says, because in the earlier book, I thought you were quoting from the earlier books, but in the earlier books, he actually says outright he believes it was hallucinations. That's what explains it. But now in this book, in this more recent book, and in that quote, he says this is a common ground where the unbeliever and the believer can agree on the fact, and then come away with different. One says it's veridical, one says it's non-veridical, and so I just thought that was interesting. I don't know if he's just trying to, sell more books to Christians or something.
No.
I don't know what the reason is, but ultimately he's kind of backed off from just saying strongly that it's hallucinations. He's more saying, I just don't know what happened. I think he's closer to E.P. Sanders, which is what E.P. Sanders basically says, and Fredrickson basically. I know they saw something, but I don't know what it was. To your point of what do we say to them when they do that? I mean, I just think once we get them to that place, I think that's a great place to get them. I think to get them to the point where the evidence leads to them absolutely convinced that they saw the risen Jesus. I think then we can. I like to talk about the deaths of these particular apostles, like Paul, like Peter, and even James. James actually, his martyrdom is testified in Josephus. Bart Ehrman actually said in one of his debates with Lacona, he agreed that Peter and Paul were martyred for their faith. So they believed that Jesus appeared to them, and they definitely gave their lives for it. So they sealed their testimony with their blood. So they gave every reason to believe it. So were they wrong? Were they deceived? Were they they wouldn't say they're liars. Ehrman wouldn't say they're liars. And so I think getting them to that point and challenging them, get them to admit that they're deceived or wrong. I think that does something. I think it's like a pebble in their shoe. The tactic. I think that's a good place to get them. But of course we can't. I think that is a great place to challenge the unbeliever. What did they see? What did they die for? But we also need to move on to other things as well. We need to challenge them about the final judgment, about their sins. We can point to also, on the positive side of meaning and purpose and forgiveness and hope for now and hope for the future. So I think there's more we need to do. But I think that right there is a powerful challenge to take the unbeliever who at least knows the evidence and take them there to that place where you're basically looking at something that changed the world. What was that something? Paul was transformed by something. It either happened in his mind or it actually happened. It wasn't just an imagination. I mean, I think that's just that takes too much faith to believe that Paul just had an imaginary friend there, and that's what transformed him. That transformed the early Christian church. That transformed the Roman Empire. That's now transformed the world. So that's how I would do it. But that would be a key challenge I would bring, is what did they see and what did they die for? Those particular ones. We don't have evidence that all the disciples died for their faith, but we do with those three: Peter, Paul, and James.
Right. And so the apparitions category is more of like a ghost, kind of like a ghost-like figure. Maybe they saw some people, when they die, they're grieving, they see like Uncle Johnny in the room, like a ghost-like figure or something sitting at the chair, that's very common. But, that's not, that's going to cause problems. And I think N.T. Wright points out the disciples knew the difference between an apparition and like a physical risen Jesus. They know that category. It's in their culture.
They thought Jesus was a ghost when he was walking on the water towards them.
Right. And then the most popular one, as with Richard Carrier and others, they keep using the hallucination category. And so basically they're saying, that the disciples had some sort of mental trick on them, that they basically didn't really see a risen Jesus. It was just something in their minds. And that would put us back to the Gospels as really being made up in a way. They report a physical Jesus, but they didn't really see a physical Jesus. They preached a physical Jesus, but there really wasn't a physical Jesus. So you go on and on. But I don't know why this one is so popular. I guess it's just because that's their last kind of attempt. That's the one they like to point to the most. Wouldn't you agree?
I would say it's their last gasp, and I just find it. Yeah, I think Dale Allison actually in his book, which I think is another one of the greatest books written on Jesus' resurrection, Resurrecting Jesus is what it's called. He has an entire about 30-page survey of exactly those type of bereavement type hallucinations, apparitions, and it's fascinating what he ends up concluding as far as what is never reported in that literature or rarely ever reported. And some of those, and pretty much all of them, are things that happened in the case of Jesus. so
Right.
if Jesus, if this was hallucinations or apparitions, it's unlike anything we have in the scientific record, anything we have in the literature, and many more things, like, for example, launching a worldwide movement. When you think that you saw your dead grandmother, you don't usually start a religion afterwards, for example. So there's things about the situation with Jesus that we don't find in any of the literature. And so Dale Allison's summary there is really good. I actually have his quote. I have his quote here with me. He said, I know you'd be talking about hallucinations. He says, this is from Resurrecting Jesus. He says, these appear to be the facts, and they raise the question of how we should explain them. The apologists for the faith say that the sightings of Jesus must, given the reports, have been objective. One person can hallucinate, but 12 at the same time, and dozens over an extended period of time. These are legitimate questions, and waving the magical wand of mass hysteria will not make them vanish. I love that. And he's very, he's very honest with the evidence. He's not one that just comes out and agrees with all of it. He's very critical. And
yeah, he's not really. He's kind of a how do you define him? I hate to categorize people. He's not a is he like deistic? I don't even know. He's like not even, I don't know what he is. Is he like kind of like he's not evangelical? I don't know. Well, anyway, I mean, he's brilliant. I'm just saying, I don't know what exactly his views are like of everything. I mean, I have a couple of his books, but anyway. Well, anyway, that's a whole other story. But the point is, yeah, you're right. So hallucination
in a different way maybe than we would say it, but I think he does accept the resurrection of Jesus. He just might do it more,
Right. So I think the point is, though, we need to press people. I did this with a girl once at Ohio State. I went over the evidence for the resurrection. I was at that point asking her, so what accounts for what they saw? She just couldn't bring herself to say, yeah, it was the physical Jesus they saw. She just wanted to stay in agnostic land and not commit. So a lot of times people know it's a commitment.
What's going on there? That's the thing.
Right, yeah. Right.
It's rarely intellectual. That's the thing. It's rarely intellectual. As you
right. So would you agree, since you've been in the scholarly world for, you're in that field, and I've read enough of the books and the debates, but it seems like no matter what you do, no matter how strong the evidence is, it seems like it boils down to some worldview issue that a lot of these guys like Ehrman, I think he says history can't really determine whether a miracle happened. It's, part of his method. It just seems like their worldview, they just can't budge, on that naturalistic view, that dead men don't rise from the dead. Like, look at Tabor here, in his book, The Jesus Dynasty, he says women do not get pregnant without a male. Jesus had a human father. Dead bodies don't rise. So if this tomb was empty, the historical conclusion is simple. Jesus' body is moved by someone and reburied. And so, that's just such an anti-supernatural bias already. And so would you agree that that's still prevalent within a lot of circles, or you think it's kind of like finding its way out now? We made a lot of progress with like books like Keener's book on miracles and things like that.
I'd still say that's the dominant thing. One of the things I like to say, if they make that point about, the historian cannot find a miracle in history, the historian can't do that. Well, I say, well, just take the day off as a historian then, and then take the day off. You don't have to be a historian today.
Right.
But yeah, I think N.T. Wright has, his book deals with that and shows how basically all of us, even kind of the Christian worldview, and in many ways the way we do apologetics, all of it's kind of clouded by the Enlightenment and what the assumptions of the Enlightenment. And he pushes for, let's go back to the mindset of the first century world, of the first century Christians. And I really like that. I think that's a great way of approaching it. That I think is more open, that's more free thinking. I think it's the true free thinking way where you're not closing out options because you have these presuppositions that basically go back to the Enlightenment ideas. So I think we just have to keep pounding that drum. But But I do think that's the dominant view in kind of the more liberal side of scholarship. That definitely is the view that you can't discover anything supernatural in history, and if you do, you're a fundamentalist. And so that's why many of them, they want to be invited to the cool parties. And so a lot of scholars, I think just will say it in it, maybe even if they admit the resurrection, they'll do it in a different way, just so they kind of pass that bar of not talking like a fundamentalist, and just say that Jesus rose from the dead in history, and we can we have good reasons to believe that based on the evidence.
Yeah, it's kind of a game.
This is ridiculous, though, when you think about how Paul would have talked about it. I just think about Paul when he met with the philosophers. He would have said, "I saw him." They would have said, "Oh, dead men don't rise from the dead." The philosophers of Athens knew that. They didn't need to have the Enlightenment. They didn't need to have David Hume tell them that. They knew dead people didn't rise, and they laughed at it. And Paul, we don't have the full account of what he said, but he probably said something like, "I saw him. He appeared to me." And they say, "Oh, well, we don't believe you." And he says, "Okay, well, I got 12 other guys. Let me introduce you to him. Peter." And James was his brother. James was his brother. Peter was his chief disciple. Oh, and by the way, there was 500 of them, and most of them are still alive. Let me introduce you to them. This is the way he would have made the argument. He would have laughed at this idea of dead men don't rise. Well, then how did Jesus rise from the dead then? I saw him.
Right. Yeah, it's always going to be a worldview issue with a lot of people, and it's hard to penetrate that. But we'll just have to keep chipping away. But some people do change their views. It does happen.
Definitely. And I get to I don't know if you like Blaise Pascal. He's kind of all the apologists of church history. He's kind of my guy. I love him. He has this great line where he says, his kind of mission was to make unbelievers wish Christianity was true, and then prove to them that it is true. And so I do think that side of, reaching the heart, which was a big thing for Pascal, I think that, like I talked about before, meaning and purpose, forgiveness and redemption, hope. These are things that all human beings across the world, they want. And I think when we show them that you really can only have these things if Jesus rose from the dead, if Christianity is true, I think that should pull their heartstrings. And then we can lay out the evidence. But I think Tim Keller does this real well in Making Sense of God. I think that book follows that kind of model of making them wish it were true. He does things with beauty and truth and all the rest. And then he gets to the evidence, or more lays out the evidence and reason for God. But Making Sense of God is a great book. I recommend to everybody.
Yeah, it is a good book.
Especially dealing with people of today.
Yeah, they have to. You have to meet their existential needs. They have to. You have to meet that side of people too. And some of them just think our faith is just bad for humanity, right? We have to show them it is good. It is a good thing, because they're reading a lot of cultural explanations, sadly, on the internet. Okay, a couple more things, and we'll get to some questions quickly. So one thing that I really appreciate about your book, which I've done a lot of research on, is, we have to provide an explanation. Historians study cause and effect relationships. Of course, how religious movements start. What's the cause of a new movement? How's it get going? How's it keep going? What sustains it? What's the little engine that got this Jesus movement going here, or big engine? So, you have this section on how we can account for the rise of the Nazarenes, this Jesus Jewish movement in the first century, eventually, goes worldwide and expands out. And so, I think hopefully all of us know on here, Roman crucifixion was very brutal, obviously terrible way to die. And then you have this really cool section where you talk about some of these other messianic movements, these leaders of these Jewish messianic movements. Now, I didn't list all yours because I already had a slide with some of them on here. That you do mention some of these, the ones Josephus mentioned, some of these names. Right. We don't have to go over each one, but the point is that, there were other messianic, revolts that took place. It doesn't mean the person was always called the Messiah, but the point is that they tried to take over Rome, or they tried to lead a revolt, and they got squashed, of course. And a lot of them, another one would try, and that got squashed, or pushed out, or the Romans destroyed it. And so you talk about this issue of why is it that the Jesus movement, why this one, was able to keep going? What was it about the Jesus movement that kept it going, then kept going on way after, the first century, it expanded out into the world. And so I just think that's a very powerful point, that people need to give an explanation for the birth of our faith. Like what got it started? Did it start on a lie? Did it start on a mental trick? Did it start on a fraud? What got this thing going? And so you want to talk about that a little bit, why that's so important, why it's an important part of your book? because I really enjoyed that part.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the fascinating things too. I wanted to bring in because, sadly, that's just not mentioned a lot in the resurrection books. N.T. Wright does a lot with that, but other than him, I haven't seen it much. And I'm just fascinated by that historical context, just a little bit before Jesus, around the time of Jesus, and about 100 years after him. Within that time period, you had this kind of messianic type fervor, or at least revolutionary type fervor, because we know of at least 14. You listed some of them, but by my count, there are 14 movements.
There's there's your slide.
This my chart from the book. It's hard to see, but
sorry. I tried.
No, it's because my book is small. But there's 14 of these movements outside of the Christian movement, and what unites them all is they all have kind of a charismatic leader, and they all gather disciples around themselves. And in the case of these other movements, unlike Jesus's, they fought against Rome, but when their leader is crucified or beheaded or imprisoned or disappears, the movement just ends. And we actually have reference to this. Remember in Acts 5, Rabbi Gamaliel brings this up and says, let's leave Peter and John and this Christian movement alone, because they're probably like all these other movements. They're from man. They're gonna fizzle out. But if they're from God, we can't fight them anyways, because we'll end up fighting against God. And so what I find fascinating is when you look at all those other movements, they basically fit Gamaliel's test. They proved to be of men. They failed, and there are no followers of Simon Bar Kokhba today. You go to Starbucks. We can't go to Starbucks during COVID, but if you go to Starbucks at some point, you're never going to sit by a follower of Simon Bar Kokhba or Simon Bar Giora or Athongus or the Egyptian prophet. We don't even know his name. None of these guys. There's nobody following them today, but there are 2.5 billion people saying that they follow Jesus of Nazareth. How is that possible? Of course, the biggest difference is that Jesus' movement survived when all the others died out. And then the question is not just that and then the historical fact is not just that it survived, but then that it continued, and it could have been wiped out many more times over the next few centuries, which the Roman leaders, the Caesars, did their best to stomp it out. And it ended up, of course, taking over the Roman Empire and on and on. But yeah, when you compare the Jesus movement to those others, another way to say it is all those other leaders stayed dead. Jesus didn't stay dead. That was the difference. I mean, that's the only explanation that makes sense to me of why the Jesus movement continued, especially when Jesus died, just like them. And when you go to the Gospels, you see that the disciples' mindset were just like the disciples of these other guys. They thought it was over. We had thought that he was going to redeem Israel, but instead he was crucified. So it's over. I mean, I think the women who went to the tomb, they just loved Jesus. But nobody probably thought this was going to continue. Nobody thought there was anything left to happen with this Jesus. They just loved him. I think that's why the women stuck with him. They just loved this man. And John maybe, but overall, their mindset was, this is over. Our Messiah has been crucified. The movement is done.
Right.
So you have to explain it historically, how it then launched from the very place he was crucified in this Big Bang type explosion, and then has gone on to take over the world. And so in every way, it's consistent. I mean, I use that hypothetical in the book. If Jesus rose from the dead, what would we expect? I mean, we wouldn't expect his movement to fizzle out and just end. Obviously, we also wouldn't expect his movement to just stay in Jerusalem for the last 2,000 years. We wouldn't even expect it to stay in Rome. I mean, Jesus said his gospel would go to all the ends of the earth. So, if what he said was true, we should see his gospel going to the ends of the earth. That's exactly what we do see. So I think experience in the last 2,000 years of history fits with the fact that Jesus rose from the dead in every way. So
that's great. And you have this chart. On this chart, you have John the Baptist ministering death. Don't Baptists today follow John the Baptist? Anyway, sorry.
That's right. That's where the Baptists begin. They go back even farther than the Catholics. They go all the way back to
right. Don't you see people in Starbucks saying, "Yeah, I'm Baptist. I follow John the Baptist." Anyway, no. Anyway, I think that is a very.
Nazarenes, I call them the Nazarenes because they're called the Nazarenes in the Book of Acts, and there's
they are right.
So they got their. They can claim themselves going back to the Nazarenes as well. So.
Right, the Nazarene Church. Right, are they all Jews in the Nazarene Church today, like they were then? Anyway, but I think that is a powerful point. I think we need to press people on what accounts for the birth of our faith? Are you saying it was founded on a fraud? Was it founded on a lie? Is it founded on, a mind trick of some kind? Because that's what it boils down to. I mean, we're saying the bodily resurrection is what accounts for what got this thing going, and what kept it going has kept it going for 2,000 years. So I think that's very, very powerful. Now, let me ask you the $10 million question, last question. So you've debated some guys, and I know you debated Carrier, and Carrier can pull stuff out of the hat, just like I debated him once on his blog like 10 years ago, and he was just throwing stuff at me. And I'm like, what is that? Where'd that come from? But what do you think for your personal experience and what you've been studying over years, what do you think is the toughest objection to the resurrection of Jesus? Maybe there isn't just one, or maybe is there anything that really you went like, God, that's something I really got to tackle. I mean, that's the one that kind of gets me, or maybe there isn't one. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I have thought about this a lot, because I really love to read, non-believers, whether philosophers or biblical historians that deny, Christianity, like Bart Ehrman, people like that. So I'm constantly wanting to steelman, the unbeliever's position, and try to understand it from their perspective as best as I can. And I mean, to be blunt, nothing that Carrier or Ehrman said do I find convincing, or any of these. A lot of these scholars. What I would say, that's probably the best argument against the resurrection would be some different line, many different lines on the problem of evil. I would say that the problem of evil probably would be in the same way it's used, against the existence of God. I would say it's the thing to challenge the lordship of Jesus, the fact that Jesus is alive. I mean, you could go down the list of, someone experiencing unanswered prayer. They cried out to Christ, they cried out to God, and we know stories like people that have experienced that, and they have no answer. And so to them, that problem that seems like Jesus isn't there, he isn't alive. Listening to them, the Yazidis, experiencing torture and rape in the ISIS camps. You get them out and you explain to them, the truth of Christianity, which I think is the only hope they have. But I could see how, their experience or someone else's personal tragedy of losing a child or losing a spouse. I know this would be more emotional, arguments, but I do think they're still the most powerful. I think these would be the most powerful reasons people would, if they knew all the facts, if they had all the evidence that we have, and they understood the truth, where the evidence leads. I think that could still be a challenge to their faith, the problem of evil. So that would be the only one that I could point to, that kind of thing. I still think I always joke that actually the most brilliant atheists ever, and who gave the greatest arguments against God ever, was an atheist created by a Christian, and that is Ivan Karamazov in The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. So, and that's basically his whole. You can go read The Brothers Karamazov, because you have the great Father the Monk's response to Ivan, and really the whole book is a response to his challenges. But I think he gives the best arguments that can be given against God, against Christianity, and it's basically problem of evil type arguments. But again, what's ironic is it's a fictional atheist that's created by a Christian, a strong Christian, Fyodor Dostoevsky. So. That's what I found. But again, if you go that way, in fact, Bart Ehrman would say the reason why he became agnostic was because of the problem of evil. But if you go that way, if you abandon God, you've basically abandoned hope. You've abandoned any hope of the justice of the righteousness of the renewal of your own soul and of the world to happen. And so I don't recommend that, but.
Yeah, when he was here, we had Bart Ehrman here years ago. We had lunch with him. He said he's rejected the faith because of the problem of evil, suffering. It wasn't even really.
You wrote that book.
Yeah. Yeah, it wasn't even really anything to do with his textual issues. And he said at lunch, he said, you flat out told us it was mostly just the problem of suffering. Well, that's what he debated when he was here. He debated with Michael Brown. That was like 2009. So that was a long time ago. But anyway, okay. Well, that's been great. So let's open it up to some people, ask some questions for Dr. Bass. I can ask 100 more questions, but I know you guys like to chime in here a little bit and maybe pick his brain a little bit on some issues if you're dealing with the resurrection or some of these issues. Does anyone want to shoot away some questions of Dr. Bass? Go for it.
I had a
Who's
question.
first? Yeah, Armand, go ahead.
Yeah, Dr. Bass, thanks so much for being with us. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you.
Um,
Honored to be here.
yeah, I had a question. You referenced kind of the appearances in the 1 Corinthians 15 creed, and I've heard the argument a lot of times. Specifically in that, for example, the appearing to the 500. And the argument kind of goes, if Jesus appeared to 500 people, why didn't some of them spill some ink and write that down or say something about that? And even aside from the 500, just why hasn't there been more ink spilled on that? I was wondering how you would respond to that.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. It's interesting. Beginning with the early church fathers, and even modern scholars agree with this. We see the connection made between Matthew 28, when Jesus goes up on the mountain, and he gives this great commission. But this would have been a mountain in Galilee. This would have been large crowds, probably, if there was especially word being spread that the resurrected Jesus, you're going to see him in Galilee. Maybe a large crowd of people, something like 500, gathered there and saw that. I do think that's possibly the same account, but we don't know that for sure. But another thing to keep in mind is, most people, especially I would say, if it was in Galilee that the 500 happened to see Jesus, most people were illiterate. Most people couldn't read or write. Most learning was done by hearing. And so that's one thing, is we just don't have that much writing. So and also there could have been writing, but it just didn't survive. So like the Gospel of Luke, at the beginning, he says many have written, undertaken to write an account of the things that have happened among us, that have been fulfilled among us. But now I'm going to write a more orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. And Mark is definitely one of the writers that Luke is referring to, but who's the others that he's referring to? They may have not survived. So there might have been a lot of writing about what they heard and saw Jesus do. But I would say still, whatever it was very limited, because we just know that really up until, even going into the Middle Ages, into the medieval era, all the way up to the right before the Reformation, the literacy was very low, reading and writing. I bet it was probably a little higher among Jews because of their emphasis on the book, but it was still very small. So yeah, it's just one of those things that when I get to heaven, I can't wait to find out all the different things that we don't know about people, especially writing and telling the stories about Jesus that just didn't make it into the New Testament, like John says at the end of John. There were so many other things I could have told you about. I've got an embarrassment of riches here. But if I were to write them all, the books wouldn't fill the whole universe.
Yeah, but don't you think, though, when people ask us, just to build on Armand's point, why isn't there any unbiased sources for Jesus outside the New Testament about the resurrection? Like, why didn't anyone write about such a big event? I mean, like Laconis says, then they'd be believers, and then you wouldn't trust them because they'd be biased, right? There has to be an unbiased, like totally unbiased source. So, that just doesn't work. That argument doesn't work, I think, at all. I mean, do you agree? Like sources outside the New Testament speaking about the resurrection, like someone writing about it, a lot of writings.
Yeah, I agree with that point. I would point out, though, that I think there's very good reason to believe that Tacitus is alluding to the resurrection claim, because he uses this word. I don't read Latin, but superstitio, the word for where we get superstition, and that's the same word used in Acts. Interestingly, where the Roman governor refers to the resurrection in that way, as this Paul's claiming this superstitio, this superstition, and Tacitus says that basically it broke out after Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. This superstition then broke out in Jerusalem, and then it went on into all over the Roman Empire. And he gives these, this negative portrayal of Rome, how it's reached Rome and things. But so I think Tacitus is alluding to it. Josephus might have talked about the resurrection. Unfortunately, everyone probably knows about this. The Christian scribes, whoever worked on Josephus's copying his thing, didn't like what he said about Jesus, or didn't think it was sufficient, and so they messed with it. They added things to it and deleted things. So, whoever those Christian scribes were, I'm going to beat them down when we get to heaven. There's going to be a beat. But I do think Josephus probably said something about the claim of the resurrection. I would bet he didn't believe in it. He didn't think Jesus was the Christ. I think he says that. Origen, actually, the early church father, had whatever Josephus said. Origen had it, and he read it. He just doesn't quote it. I wish he quoted it. But he does tell us that Josephus didn't believe Jesus was the Christ, and the interpolation that the Christian scribe put in there, Josephus says he is the Christ. And so we know, at least from Origen, that Josephus denied that Jesus was the Christ. But I bet you he probably said something about the claim of the resurrection too. But we just, sadly, unless the sands of time unearth another great manuscript, we just don't know what Josephus said.
Right.
But I would bet. I'm betting everything now. If it happens while I'm alive, you can take it to the bank. He said something about the claim of the resurrection.
Right. It's kind of like that cards, you have the deck of cards you play with. This is the hand you're dealt as in a story. And like Lacona says, this is the deck you've got. And so maybe we want a different deck, but it doesn't work that way with history. This
right.
is the deck we've been dealt. So you have to work with the deck you have and try to win.
It is amazing what we have, though. We have so much.
Yeah.
My goodness. We have this embarrassment. I mean, especially when we compare the New Testament documents, 27 different books put together in this corpus that we call the New Testament.
Right.
Compare that to anything in the ancient world. I mean, even Bart Ehrman would say it's the best attested documents in the ancient world. I mean, it's an incredible thing what we have.
He's going to come around. You'll see. Okay, who's next? Anybody have another question?
Could I actually ask a follow-up, Eric?
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up on what you said, Dr. Bass. Kind of standing in the skeptic's shoes, and I could see an argument they would make. If a lot of the old ancient world was illiterate, why does that not apply to the gospel authors or the New Testament authors? Would you say that that's just because they had scribal use and whatnot?
Well, it would depend on which author we're talking about. For example, Matthew. If it is Matthew, as a tax collector, he would have been one of the few people that for sure his job would have required writing. So Matthew would have been someone who would have been writing and reading as a part of his regular job. And so if Matthew did write Matthew, which I think he did, then that would explain Matthew. Luke is very clearly a trained person who's writing in the field of Greco-Roman history. He's wanting to write like a new Herodotus, like a Thucydides. Luke is clearly, the way he introduces his work is very, and even Josephus, you can see, if you parallel Josephus's introductions to his works to Luke's, you see that those parallels. Luke is clearly a trained scholar. He's someone who, he's called a doctor, a medical doctor. So we know he had that training, but clearly he also was using his skills that he probably learned in his very, Hellenistic type education that he received. And so then you're left with John and Mark, and yeah, you could talk about scribes. Mark, interestingly, is talked about as the worst Greek one of the worst examples of Greek in the New Testament. And so Mark might be, this may be just, a Jewish guy that learned Greek, and it's just not that great. He's taken the sermon notes of Peter. I think Mark is basically the eyewitness testimony of Peter. So it's one of the early church fathers basically calls it the Memoirs of Peter. And so that makes sense with Peter. I mean, with Mark, and then John. John lives the longest, and John's dated by all scholars to 90 AD. So I think that's more than enough time for him to learn, Greek and write the way he writes. An interesting thing we know about Josephus is Josephus, was from the same area as these guys, like John, Galilee. Josephus grew up there, and he spoke and wrote in Aramaic, and he actually tells us in, I think it's in it's either Against Appian or one of his works. He says at the beginning that he wrote it originally in Aramaic, but because he wanted a wider audience, he translated it into Greek. And he talks about how he took the pains, he uses the word pains, to learn Greek. And it was very difficult, but he did it. And so I think Peter, as the leader of the church, trying to spread the gospel to the ends of the earth. I think John. I think these guys had every, motive and inspiration to want to learn the lingua franca. Basically to learn the English of that day, which was Greek. And so I see that as they would have learned it, and that way it would have, just like Josephus, it would have had that wider audience. They wouldn't have just been writing for the Jews in this particular area of the Roman Empire. They would have been writing for everyone if they wrote in Greek.
But to Ramon's point, though, can we, tactically speaking, when we're talking to people about these issues, like he's bringing up these objections and things, can't we turn it and just say, like Ehrman, like, don't you, even there's issues like you want more evidence, more writings and stuff, can we get them to agree on the bedrock facts? Those 3 facts, and then go from there. If someone can't agree on those, then we can go, then we can talk about the resurrection versus, Ramon, maybe you're talking to people who don't accept the bedrock facts. That's what I would do in a tactical perspective. Like, you know what I mean? Wouldn't you agree, Justin? Try to get them to the bedrock. Do you agree with these 3 points? That the evidence does at least give us this much? Would you agree with that?
Agreed upon by everyone. So if you start there, I think you then can challenge them straight with the resurrection. But I do think, a lot of people might have, maybe they're like, okay, I see good reasons for that, but I want to know if these gospels are trustworthy. Then I think we lay out the evidence for that. And I think we have good, strong, not only evidence, but we have great scholars like Richard Malcolm and others who have written, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses is a great book I'd recommend on the
second edition.
Second edition, the reliability of the gospel authors, that they're actually the gospel authors that are, there it is. I have it somewhere over here. Take me a while to find it.
That's a long read. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, it's another long one. F.F. Bruce's, if you want a small little book that gives you a lot of the goods on all this in like 60 pages, F.F. Bruce has a book called The Reliability of the New Testament Manuscripts or something like that?
Yeah, Reliability of New Testament Documents. Yeah, that was a classic.
It's a great little book, and it lays out great arguments on the manuscript side, but also on the authorship of the Gospels, reliability. So it's a great little book you want to have and read. Martin Hengel, by the way, a top scholar, Bart Ehrman would say, one of the top scholars of the 20th century, German. He's written probably the definitive argument for the authorship, the genuine, like the authorship of the Gospels by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In his, it's a work called Studies in Mark, and that is like, it's so cool because I read, I'm actually teaching through the Gospel of Mark right now with a group, and so I read all the liberal commentaries and scholarship on it, and they're always dealing with Hengel. They can't, they don't think that John wrote, Mark wrote Mark, but they're like, oh, but Hengel's got a good argument there. So I love that. It shows you how formidable he is.
Yeah, I don't. Well, anyway, we get to gospel.
Those Germans. There's something about being a German in New Testament scholarship. Have an extra. It's like having that English accent. It's like having that British accent. You're just automatically, smarter.
Okay. Who else wants to ask a question? Anybody? Someone next?
I have a question.
Yes. Those headphones look pretty cool there.
Thanks. Hi, Dr. West. Thank you for being with us tonight. I'm sorry, what was Hengel's first name real quick?
Martin.
Okay.
Hengel.
Thank you so much. Some years back, I was talking extensively with an atheist who sent me a Richard Carrier video. And one of the things that was new for me, and I can't remember if it was the gospel as myth or what it was, but he had a lot of this stuff like showing the gospels like were written like in ring poetry. And I can't remember if he had like chiasmus or something, but what do you think about the people that make the argument that this is just a fictional work because can't you tell this is like the other poems of the day? And, obviously he's throwing out a lot of the historical facts and stuff, but have you heard things about the ring poetry?
I haven't, and you know that it's similar to what Eric was saying before. You know, Carrier has so many strange and weird things. You know, he's really a brilliant person. He's well read, he's brilliant, but he has so many weird views and strange theories, and so he pulls weird things and connections that no one else makes and no one's ever made over the last 2,000 years, and there's a reasons no one's made them. Somehow his brain puts those things together. And so, yeah, I'd have to see exactly what he's talking about. I'm not familiar with that.
There's a video. But Carla, you asked Craig Blomberg that question. I think it's on the video with him. Remember he answered it?
No, I don't remember.
Yeah,
I'm
he asked him the same question, and he answered it. He knew what it was, and he answered it. Yeah, when we had him on.
Yeah,
Sorry. Did your work's not cut, Justin? He answered it for you. Craig bailed you out. You can email him. Yeah, Craig did know what that was. I can't remember what he said, but when you brought up that ring thing, he was familiar with it, and he knew Carrier because he co-wrote a book on the resurrection with Carrier, and he's familiar with some of that weird stuff. So, but yeah, he did.
Craig Blomberg is suffering with for the rest of us by watching the Carrier video.
Right. Anyway, but yeah, so it's on the video from the Craig Blomberg episode. Sorry. Anyway,
but just a general point, like the Luke, you know, one thing that's for sure. I mean, when the way Luke introduces his work, he's wanting you to think, he's wanting you to know that he's writing in the line of people like Herodotus and Thucydides, like I said, and these people are writing. They're doing their best at that time in history to write history, you know, to write what really happened. That's what makes those guys, Herodotus and Thucydides, kind of considered the fathers of historical writing. And so Luke is writing in that vein, and he's saying, I want to give you exactly what happened. And there's so many, you know, individually, when you go through the account, there's all these reasons, you know, I could go down many examples of why, you know, it's very clear that this is written as something that really happened. This is not some myth. This isn't, you know, this is nothing like, you know, the writings of Ovid or, you know, or Homer, or, you know, where the gods come down and are engaging in things. You know, this is written as history. A good example in Mark that comes to mind is the fact that Mark brings up the sons of Simon the Cyrene. Mark, out of the blue, just says, you know, Simon the Cyrene, who carried the cross behind Jesus, he's the father of Rufus and Alexander. And an interesting parallel to that is a Rufus is mentioned in Romans 16 as one of the people Paul greets. And so it's an interesting, could be one of those designed coincidences that you have the same Rufus, who was the son of Simon of Cyrene. Mark was writing to Rome as well, and the Roman church knew him real well because he was the son of the man who carried the cross. He you know, if you go deeper, maybe he came to Christ. His children came to Christ. His wife came to Christ, and maybe he's died since then. But his sons are still a part of the Christian church in Rome, and so Paul testifies to it, and Mark testifies to this Rufus and Alexander. But again, you wouldn't bring, you know, there's no reason to bring up Rufus and Alexander if you're writing a myth. And you can go with Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus. You know, there's a lot of little references that clearly show that he's writing to an audience who would recognize these people. They're people they knew.
Okay. Well, anyway, so we got the Craig Blomberg clip. We can find that one. It's on my YouTube channel. But yeah, I remember that question. I remember the person who asked you about that, Carla, too. I remember him. Okay. Carla, you want to follow up with anything? Or I'm going to jump to somebody else. Anything?
I was just going to ask really quickly. I in this I was studying the Greek alphabet, and someone was saying that James and Jude were written in like Hebrews was a really higher level form of Greek, maybe like Luke, and that James and Jude were also very good Greek, like John was like more baby Greek or something. And he said that James and Jude, being the half brothers of Jesus, because they went and would do business in Sepphoris and stuff, and also because they had to get the letters out to the diaspora, that they knew Greek pretty well. Would you concur with that?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. For one, Hebrews is considered probably the best Greek of the New Testament, and then you'd have Luke and Acts, and then you'd have First Peter and James and Jude are up there as some of the best Greek of the New Testament. And yeah, that would be my argument with James. Again, as the leader of the church, you could also argue that he learned it, like we know Josephus took pains to learn it. But also an interesting archaeological fact is Sepphoris, think it's Pphoris. You can Google it, but Sepphoris was a Greek city that was about, I think, just maybe a couple hours walk from Nazareth. And if Jesus and his brothers and Joseph as carpenters, and the word for carpenter, by the way, can mean like brick mason. It's a more general word than just working with wood. It's very likely that there's a lot of scholarship written on this that they would have very likely gone to work at Sepphoris, because Sepphoris was being built at the exact time while Jesus grew up, and James and the rest. And so if they were going there, Sepphoris was a completely Greek city. All business there would have been spoken in Greek. And there was plays there. They've excavated actual theaters there, of course, temples and things. So it's fascinating to think of Jesus and his brothers maybe going to see some of the Greek theaters there. They went to see the movies of their day. But I think the argument that they interacted with Greek a lot more is very strong. There's a scholar. It's more of a scholarly book, but one of the main scholarly book that argues this is a guy named Sevenster, Sevenster. He's
Oops. You guys, he's frozen. Uh-oh. Hold on, Justin. Come back to us. I don't know what happened there. He froze up. Hopefully he'll come back. Come back, Justin. Come back, Dr. Bess. Hello. He just like, oops. I was like, is everyone else still there? I was trying to find that book he mentioned by Martin Hengel. Hopefully he'll come back to us. Martin Hengel. Let's see here. It's on the Gospels. Well, the good news is if we lost him, we got most of everything done. But anyway. Anyway, where is that book he wrote? Oh, he has so many books. I'm looking on Amazon. Where is it? I can't find it, of course. Anyway, is he back? He's not back. Hello. He'll have to log back in. He'll come back. But anyway, what were we talking about with him? Oh yeah, about the Greek. Anyway, yeah. Yeah. So I can't find. It's funny, that book he's talking about by Hengel. I know what it is. It's on the Gospels. Martin Hengel was he says he got knocked out. Huh. Let me ask him if he wants to come back. We may just have to wrap it up. Oh, let me try to it says he needs to log back in. I can't admit him. Well, can't seem to get back on for some reason. I won't allow him to come back in. Okay.
Eric, is
Yes.
the book, the four Gospels and the one Gospel of Jesus Christ, is that the one?
That's it.
Is that the one the atheists respect?
I don't know whether they respect it. I don't even know if any of them have even read it. It makes its way. He's coming back to us. Hold on. He says he got back in. But that is the book. It's hard. It's a hard read though. It came out a while ago, but that is the book he's talking about.
Okay.
He says he's coming back. But as we're waiting, and we only have like 10 more minutes anyway. Oh, there he is. He's back. Coming back. Justin, you there? You back? There he is.
about
How
that.
dare you? What is this? Like the Avengers? You like come and go, like different like zones or whatever.
What did I do? Just freeze? Did I freeze and then just disappear?
Yeah, you look great. You're like this. You're like, eh. Anyway, I was like, where'd he go? Anyway, so yeah, so I was just telling her that Martin Hengel book is the hold on, someone's really loud. Okay. I was telling her the Martin Hengel book is the 4 Gospels and the 1 Gospel. Was that the 4 Gospels and the 1? I read it like so many years ago.
Yeah, he probably makes it in that one too. The one that I know that's a smaller book that he just spends the time on the authorship is it's called Studies in Mark. I think it's called.
Oh,
Studies.
that's right. That's right. The 4 Gospels and the 1 Gospel of Jesus Christ. Yeah, that was the big one.
That's another one. Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm sure he definitely makes the argument there. I don't think I've read that one, but the Studies in Mark is one I'm looking at right now. That's really great. It's shorter too. For his books are usually big. Where did I cut off before?
I don't even know, but thank you for coming back. I thought we lost you for good.
Yeah.
He's gone. We can't handle it. 10 more minutes. No.
You were talking. You said the name Sebenster, and then you left.
Good. Okay. So yeah, so it froze right that was the last thing I said. So yeah, it was called "Do You Speak Greek?" And that's the line from Acts when the Roman soldier is talking to Paul, and Paul switches from Aramaic and starts speaking to him in Greek. And the Roman soldier says, "Do you speak Greek? I thought you were that barbarian." See, another one of those revolutionaries that led 4,000 into the wilderness. But Sevenster, "Do you speak Greek?" That's the book that argues that the Jews were much more conversant in Greek than most people think.
You know what I do when we lose speakers? I bring this up on the screen just to give people a laugh. I go like that. See, a little.
Nice.
See, it's missing an arm. Anyway, my daughter made this like 2 years ago, and then if we show it to people, they take it and you throw it or something. Anyway, okay, that was a bad joke. But who else has some questions? A couple more. We're going to head out soon. Anybody else want to ask Dr. Baska a question? Anybody?
Ferris? Bueller?
Ferris? Dr. Bach always said, Eric, here's what you got to do. Going once, going twice. Anybody? No questions. You've got it all figured out about the resurrection. Well, God bless your heart. Anyway, God bless your little hearts. You've got it all figured out. No, go ahead.
I think Charles does.
Charles, go ahead.
Wasn't so much of a question, but I guess I could create a question. Definitely thank you for your presentation. It definitely has given a lot of answers to some questions that I've had in my mind. I know you spent some time and you were talking about the difference in the time when some of the Gospels may have been written. When I thought about it, and it just might be just my little frail mind thinking, is that Jesus at one point, he said, some of you won't taste death before I come back again. Could it be possible that like immediately after Jesus had died, even those few years after that, like even for the disciples and the apostles, that it wasn't no urgency to write of something that was not, that wasn't going to be relevant? I mean, like for instance, now we may be hearing more or seeing more things written about the civil rights movements as those persons that was alive during those times and active in those times. You see a lot more writings about them now than you did, in the early 70s when they were still relevant. What are your thoughts about that?
That's a good parallel because they were busy. They didn't have time to write. they were getting to work.
That's right.
Getting to work, giving people freedom. That's right. Yeah. In fact, that's when I talk about the dating of the Gospels. That's actually what I argue. I do think that the apostles, I think they thought, they didn't think for sure when Jesus was going to return, but I think they believed that Jesus was going to return very soon, probably in their lifetime. In fact, it makes sense they would think that when the angels that they saw came to them. Remember when Jesus ascends into heaven in Acts 1, and the angels say, "What are you doing? Get to work. Jesus is going to return exactly the way you saw him leave." And so they got to work. They spread the gospel as far and wide as they could across the Roman Empire. Paul, Peter, all of them. And so it makes sense that in the 60s, when some of these apostles, key apostles like Peter and Paul started to be martyred, or it was looking like, the writing was on the wall for some of them, it makes sense why, maybe that was what triggered someone like Mark to say, "Hey, Peter, this is looking dangerous. I want to write down everything you're saying, everything that you're going around teaching, I want to write down and get it written down for the next generation in case you're not going to be here with us. And that's exactly how the early church fathers argue Mark wrote basically the first gospel. Why he wrote the first gospel was because he wanted to get Peter's preaching down in case he died. So I do think that was probably the reasoning for at least the first gospel for Mark. I bet you Mark wanted that message of Peter to be, disseminated across the empire, and he knew Peter was, at risk, and who knows what could have happened, especially under Nero. Nero was the leader at that time. So yeah, I think that is the reason, at least for Mark. John had different reasons. Clearly, John just didn't want to write a gospel early on, but since he lived so long, he probably said, "Hey, I want to, I want to share my wisdom with the world." So he wrote, this masterpiece that we get at his mature age. John, who saw everything. I mean, my goodness, John was there at the cross. He had a vision of the second coming of Jesus. I mean, how many people have seen both the cross and the second coming of Jesus? John.
I thank you for that. That's very enlightening. I would just, when I think about that, there were some things my auntie, one of my favorite aunties, she had a few holiday desserts that she used to make, and she used to have some things, and nobody knew the recipe, but we had a couple of years when she was sick. Within those couple of years, I numerous times asked her about those recipes, but while she was living, those things weren't relevant. I didn't pay no attention to, for all the years that she was making it, and there was no problem, there was no danger. I just knew that she was going to make them, and it was going to be there. So I thank you. That helps me out a lot.
All right. Thank you.
Justin, don't you think a lot of people don't understand, as moderns, we try to place our expectations on the New Testament, of course, from a westernized 21st century perspective. We understand the oral culture at that time, how oral it was. There's all kinds of issues. We just come to the text with all these presuppositions that just don't work sometimes. Wouldn't you agree? A lot of times.
True. Yeah. We do our best. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, trying to. I like what one of my professors said at DTS. He said, "You read the Bible until you read the 21st century out of it," but it's hard.
It's good.
It's hard to do that.
Great. That's very good. All right, one last one. That'd be about it. Anybody have anything? We'll wrap it up.
Just tap it.
Tom, where you been, man? I haven't seen you forever.
I'm still on this planet.
I noticed. Well, it's good to have you back. Anyway, it's good to see you. Go ahead.
Great presentation, Dr. Bass. Thank you for the education you've given us tonight.
Sure.
You mentioned that there's a general scholarly agreement that the Apostle John died approximately 90 years AD. Is that really a pretty good consensus? And what solidity of evidence do we have for that?
Well, let me clarify. What I was saying, the consensus is that John, whoever John was, wrote that gospel around that time, around 90 AD. So again, this would be, with the Gospels, a lot of times this is just a split between conservative and liberal scholars, and this would be another example of that. So everyone would agree that, not everyone, but most would agree, a consensus at least would agree, that the Gospel of John was written somewhere around 80 to 90 AD. It's the last of the four Gospels.
Yeah.
But who wrote that Gospel, that's where the debate would lie. So liberal scholars would say it was clearly somebody that, was a Christian, that knew a lot about, that area, the area of Judea, but they wouldn't say, most liberal scholars, someone like Bart Ehrman wouldn't say John, the son of Zebedee, wrote that. But conservative scholars, of course, would make strong, like Martin Hengel and those other guys I mentioned. In fact, Balcom actually comes out with a different, he actually argues that the Gospel of John was written by an eyewitness, but not John, the son of Zebedee. So he does this kind of about face here with bringing in an eyewitness, but not John. But I don't know why he would do that. But the early church testimony, this is something that just gets ignored by the liberal scholarship. They basically just ignore the early church testimony, which I think is ridiculous, because they were so serious. When you study the early church fathers, they hated anonymous, pseudonymous writings, basically writings written according to like claiming to be by Peter, and it really wasn't by Peter. And we have examples where they excommunicated people who did that, who wrote things, and sometimes with good intentions. They wrote books claiming to be Paul, and of course it wasn't Paul. It was they know who wrote it. And so they excommunicated him. So they were very serious. And so I think there are internal arguments within the Gospels that support these ideas, but the authorship that we know, but I think the early church just got it right. I mean, they were zealous to make sure that who wrote the books that were in their New Testament were written by the actual apostles. This was a key criteria for them, that it had to have been written by an apostle or someone associated with an apostle and in the first century. And so I think they got it right. I think we have in the Gospel of John, the basically the unique, incredible masterpiece testimony from one of the closest disciples of Jesus, the one who laid in his breast. So,
or as we say today, they called out the fake news.
That's right.
Basically, there's no evidence really solid in any way, shape, or form about a time of death of Apostle John. We have no evidence in that case.
The early church father testimony is that he lived the longest of them all, and that he lived into the time of Trajan. I think it's Irenaeus who makes that point. And this is another really cool kind of outside of the New Testament, I would say, unbroken tradition that goes back to the apostles. So we have Irenaeus, who's writing around 180 AD, and Irenaeus tells us that he grew up listening to Polycarp, and Polycarp, we also have writings from him. He says Polycarp was a disciple of John.
Yes.
So you go from Irenaeus to Polycarp to John to Jesus. So you got this unbroken tradition, even outside of the New Testament, of testimonies from the apostle, which then would go back to Jesus. And so that's why it's interesting. We get stories even about teachings that aren't in the New Testament in Irenaeus about Jesus and about John. And I think we have good reason to accept it, because you have that unbroken tradition there.
Yeah, Polycarp was, I think, definitely John's greatest disciple, if you will.
That's right.
One last comment that's not per se a question, but interesting to have your input in on. The reason, in my opinion, the only logical reason I can find for so many people, disciples and countless persons since, being willing to go to their grave, sometimes in a very hideous and horrible fashion, was because they believed the words of Christ, that there was an eternal judgment to fear, to avoid, and that gave them an incentive. It was worth everything to them to get that word across, because they were taught to love people that much. That's an argument obviously I use with atheists and agnostics to one degree effect or another. But I found there's another group for which I have to use the same argument, the same logic, and that is to believers who do not believe in a literal hell. Is it wise to try to use that argument to try to justify Scripture? And it's sort of a roundabout question.
To make the point, are you saying to make the argument that there's a literal hell?
If we believe the words of Christ and there is a literal eternal hell, obviously many of us, many believers, many wonderful, wonderful people do not believe that. They believe there's a heaven, and then if there's no hell, you just sort of poof and go away. Various terms for that. But I cannot find any rational logic to say that people would allow themselves to be tortured to death unless they believed in the depths of their heart that they were warning somebody. The greatest spiritual giant I ever knew, an old gentleman dead for several years named Clifford Richards. That's how God got him to where he was. He had a vision one time, and he saw a very wide road and people, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people just marching down this road, and the road suddenly ended. It just went down, just fell off, people walking off this edge into a burning pit. And he was standing back on the side of the road watching, and he cried out to God, Lord, can't this be stopped? Can no one warn them? And the question to him was, are you willing? And so he said yes. And so the rest of his life was spent warning. But I don't know. I found an interesting parallel that the same logic I use on atheists, I also use on, many believers.
Well,
Anyway.
I think that's a great point. I mean, if I was going to, discuss this issue with someone who claimed to be a Christian and they said there is no hell, I would take them directly to the words of Jesus and to Revelation and on and say, okay, they teach clearly that there is a hell. So how do you deal with that? So I think there are, within Christianity, there are debates about the issue, the nature of hell and things like that. But yeah, you can't get around the scriptures that there is going to be this punishment, that there is going to be this judgment and this judgment of the wicked. So I would take I think the scripture, because they're, if they're Christian, they believe that, the scriptures are from God. So how can they deny what the scriptures could clearly teach?
I know many who do. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us this evening.
Thank you. Great questions.
Tom, thanks for coming back. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Yeah, well, listen, Dr. Bass, thanks for coming tonight. We appreciate it. Everyone, please get his book. We talked about it. You can get it on Kindle, I think $9.99. I know he wishes it was like $100 like I just keep lowering my prices on my books when they don't sell. He says lower them. Anyway, no, but your books were $9.99 anyway.
I don't control it.
Yeah, right. I get to control everything. That's what I like to sell now anyway. Maybe your publisher will get one of mine someday. I actually review a lot of their books. They send them to me. Well, listen, thanks for coming. We wish you all the best in your teaching endeavors in Dallas. Hopefully it'll work out with what God has for you guys there. And when you can, if you're put there for a long time or whatever it is, I'm sure you'll land somewhere. And we look forward to more books you'll write, and we'll be watching. Remember, you can go online, watch a couple of Dr. Bass's debates. He did debate Bart Ehrman, like you said, and Richard Carrier. You can watch those online. Do you have a website or anything? Do you have your own website like everyone does?
I don't have a website, but I do have. Just recently, actually, a good friend of mine who's very tech savvy, he put all my videos that I've done over the years and my debates and lectures, interviews, all the things I've done since I've been in town, which have been a lot for this book. They're all in one place on my YouTube channel. So if you type in I think it's Dr. Justin Bass, it's all like together, Dr. Justin Bass, Dr. Justin Bass, into YouTube, it should come up, my YouTube channel.
Okay. Great.
You can
I
see
remember
a bunch of videos. I got a bunch of videos on there.
And you debated Ehrman on whether Jesus was God, right? Wasn't that the name of that debate?
Yeah. Whether the historical Jesus claim to be divine was our
right.
Exact.
That's right. That's right.
I chose that because I wanted to debate him on something that he couldn't punt to that presupposition, the supernatural. Because basically, if he was honest, if he was willing to cede the debate, he could cede the debate and still be an agnostic, because Jesus could have claimed to be God and you could still believe that he was just wrong or lying.
Right.
But I wanted to get him to that point. I wanted to get him to the point of Jesus did claim to be God, so what are you going to do with it? It's the same point of the what did the disciples see? They saw it and died for it. Were they wrong? Was Paul wrong? Right.
Well, I appreciate you willing to do those debates, especially to debate Richard Carrier. Anyone that would do that takes a lot of patience. I know, because I thought I'd bring him here to Hyatt State, but I just, whatever. He's been here lectured a couple of times, but anyway.
I'll just tell you real quick on that one. What's really cool about that one is, honestly, I have a rule. I don't know if I had the rule then, but since I've wrote this book, I'm not going to waste time debating a mythicist, because I feel like there's just no common ground. And I feel like if they're a mythicist already, they're not taking history seriously and the sources seriously. So I think it would be a waste of time.
Which means he doesn't believe Jesus existed. Yeah, that's what
exactly. But this was an exception, and I would still do this in the future, because what happened here is there was actually this, what they called they call them, I can't remember the name, but it's a group in Milwaukee. It has mythicists in the title. Mythicists Milwaukee, and they put on this conference. It was their conference. So it was basically all atheists, and most of them were mythicists. And they brought me in. They actually paid for me to be flown out to Milwaukee to debate. Richard Carrier was their guy. And we debated in a bar, and there was like 200 people there. And I'm telling you, there were probably I had one guy afterwards go, "Oh, I'm a Christian, man. That was great." but there was like 200 atheists in this room and debate, and it's on my YouTube channel. But it was great. I will always do that. I don't care who it is. If they want to invite me and pay me to come and share the gospel, I will.
Right. Yeah, well, that actually, I've done some events with atheists. It can be fun. I mean, it's challenging, but it can be fun too. It
It
just
was great.
depends.
They were really nice, and it was very
Yeah, they're,
cordial. We
I
watched
know.
that. That was real
People
friendly.
would say to you, like, why would you want to do that? That's crazy. But anyway, you never know. Okay, well, listen, you take care, and we appreciate you coming on, taking your time, and I'll follow up with you. But once again, thank you so very much, and blessings to you and your family. And maybe we'll have you back again at some point.
Love to. Thanks, brother.
Okay,
Y'all
you
have a
take
great
care.
night.
God bless you, everyone. I'm going to stay on for a minute to talk to you about next week. But have a good week, Dr. Bass. Take
God
care.
bless.
Okay. All right, everyone. Just a quick announcement about next week. We've got Alicia, I think it's Childer coming on. I always butcher her name. But anyway, she's written this book called, she was in a very popular Christian band, by the way. You'll know it when she comes on. But she's got this book out called Progressive Christianity. And she is really, really getting very popular talking about this topic, how in the churches these days, a lot of people are not believing a lot of the core tenets of the faith. We're not talking about unbelievers. We're talking about Christians, that we're struggling, like Tom, you were saying a little bit, that you've got people in the churches that are really buying into a lot of stuff that, is really interesting, what they're kind of like redefining our beliefs. And she tackles that in that book. It's called Progressive Christianity. I could actually look it up. Let me just look it up real quick. I'll get her name right here, because I'm so bad at names. Progressive, let's type it in here I'll type it in here on Amazon. Progressive, there it is. It is by Elisa, here, I'll type in the link right here. Here we go, I'll type it on the chat. Yes, Eric, please do. You'll make it so much easier on all of us. Here it is right here. There's the book. Alicia Childers, is it? How do you say that? Childers. Alicia Childers. Anyway, Childers. It's called Another Gospel, A Lifelong Christian Seeks Truth in Response to Progressive Christianity. This book has become very popular, and she's getting a lot of radio shows on it, so it's pretty well known, so that'll be good. Anyway, so I'm looking forward to that next week. She's looking forward to being on, but I think you'll really enjoy that. You need to be aware of that, because that's in a lot of the churches these days. I dealt with it myself. Anybody else have any other comments or anything before we kind of wrap up here? Pray us out. Anybody? Are you all worn out? Jesus is risen. Yes, we proved it tonight. Anybody?
Eric, I was just going to say that I listened to his debate with Bart Ehrman and
oh, did you?
Ph.D. today. Yeah.
How was it?
Didn't seem like he was able to, even meet halfway. They just kind of bounced back and forth.
They talk past each other a lot. They talk past each other. Yeah, that's the way it is with Bart. Bart's a very good debater. He was trained in debate in high school when we had him here. He's very good at rhetoric. Substance and rhetoric are two different things. You can have great rhetoric, but crummy substance. I listen to substance. So guys that are great on rhetoric, I'm like, I'm like, so what? You talk great and you're eloquent and you got all this rhetoric, but what are your arguments? What's the substance? But yeah, Bart's hard to debate though. He's hard to debate. He's a good debater. Mike Lacona talked about that. So so you obviously are saying that you didn't really get much out of it.
No, actually I did. We didn't quite finish it because it's 2.5 hours or something.
What else you got to do? What's wrong with you? Come on. What else you got to do with your time? Can't you just sit inside all day and watch debates? That's what COVID's about. We sit home and watch debates, right? Anyway, no, I knew he debated him. Yeah, I've seen a little part of it, but okay, well, good. I'm glad you got to watch it. Isn't that exciting? So you knew what he looked like when he came on tonight. There he is. Anyway, anybody else? Any other comments or questions before we kind of head out? Anybody? Have you guys been reading the Jerome Bible commentary? Someone got me this book for my 50th birthday. Have you ever heard this book? Love Does. I still haven't read it. I don't know why they got this for me. Anyway, throw it back on the shelf. Anybody else have any other comments, questions, anything? Nothing. You guys are kind of worn out. We'll try to get his book, The Bedrock, or you can get my book. It's better. No, anyway, I did write a book on the resurrection. It's on Amazon, but I did mention some of the same things Justin mentioned. Mine has more of a Jewish slant. to it naturally. But anyway, so we'll do something on the resurrection again. There'll be plenty more things on the resurrection. But if nobody has any more comments or questions, I guess I'm just going to pray us out. You want to take one last look at this thing with the arms missing?
I have one more question, Eric.
Yeah.
As good as that is. One of the things that Bart Ehrman was talking about is Yeshua not being God.